Implementing Western-style elections and institutions in Muslim countries. Hosted by the Nixon Center. This is about an hour and 45 minutes.
I don't know. We can work on this. Is this on? Everything on? Oh. Can you hear me? Through the mic? No. No? Okay. All right. Good afternoon. I'm Zeyno Baran, Director for International Security and Energy Programs at the Nixon Center. And I am really pleased to be holding this event today to discuss whether the U.S. should work with the Islamists in the Middle East, the broader Muslim world, as well as in non-Muslim majority areas such as Europe. I know it's a rather provocative question, and I'm delighted that we have two excellent speakers to debate this issue today. Before I introduce them, let me say a few words of why I think this debate is so timely and critically important. I think there are two key issues here. First is the question of Al-Qaeda and related terrorist organizations that are using political Islam as an ideology. How do we deal with these terrorists? I have an article in the current issue of Foreign Affairs discussing this with the title, Fighting the War of Ideas. In this article, I suggest that given that the terrorists are only the tip of the iceberg of a larger group of Islamists engaged in ideological warfare, and not just with the West, but first and foremost with moderate Muslims. We need to work with those moderate Muslims who are engaged in this theological and ideological civil war that is currently taking place within the Muslim world. The other side of the argument is that the moderates are too weak, not sufficiently funded, and will not be able to take on the terrorists. And in fact, the argument goes, the only group that can really take on the terrorists are the Islamists that are not engaged in terrorism, such as the Muslim Brotherhood and others. I know that people inside the US government are considering this approach, and I was recently in London to meet with British authorities, and I heard similar considerations from them. The second key issue in this debate is how the US should promote democracy in the Middle East and the Muslim world, when Islamists may be the ones that benefit most from such openings. Now, without further ado, to discuss these two key questions and the broader issues, let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Reuel Marc Gerecht, resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of The Islamic Paradox, Shiite Clerics, Sunni Fundamentalists, and the Coming of Arab Democracy. He is a contributing editor for The Weekly Standard and a correspondent for The Atlantic Monthly, and is a frequent contributor to leading newspapers. He formerly held positions as the director of the Middle East Initiative for the Project for the New American Century, and as a Middle Eastern specialist in the Central Intelligence Agency. Our second speaker is Daniel Pipes, director and founder of the Middle East Forum, and also a member of the Advisory Council of the National Interest magazine. Many of you are probably already on his email list, but if you're not, there's a sign-up sheet outside. You can also find his writings on www.danielpipes.org. He's an incredibly prolific writer and a columnist for the New York Sun, Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, and the Jerusalem Post. His most recent book, Miniatures, Views of Islamic and Middle Eastern Politics, appeared in 2003. He has served in various capacities in the U.S. government, including 2 presidentially appointed positions, vice chairman of the Fulbright Board of Foreign Scholarships, and member of the board of U.S. Institute of Peace. I've asked each speaker to talk for about 10 minutes. Then each will have about 3 to 4 minutes for rebuttal, and then we will take questions from the audience. Again, thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to a vibrant and exciting discussion. Now, Reuel, please.
Thank you. I was just asking whether this podium was going to discriminate against short people, tall people, since right up there. I'd just like to just open with a few quick comments. Time is limited here, but first I'd like to say that the overall rubric of this debate perhaps is a little off-key in the sense that I don't believe the United States government should support Islamists. If you were to take that in sort of mutatis and mutandis, put that onto an American context, it's like saying Reuel Gerecht supports the Democratic participation of Hillary Clinton in American politics, therefore Reuel Marc Gerecht supports Hillary Clinton for president. I don't think it's a terribly good logical sequence. I think that it is correct to say that I'm in favor of the elections being open, and that for Islamists participating in those elections, and that is a key element in what I would describe as the evolution of democracy in the Middle East, and that it will be impossible to see that evolution unless they participate. I'd also like to just say here that I'm very pleased to be here with Daniel Pipes. I think Daniel has almost single-handedly done a great service to public discourse in this country, certainly post 9/11, but also pre, and keeping the discussion of Islam both vivid and open, and fighting back what I would call the nasty tendencies of political correctness, which are particularly noteworthy inside Islamic studies. And I don't think Daniel gets enough credit for that. On this issue, I mean, it's interesting. I'll just have a quick medieval allusion. I can't go back too far, as I am wont, because of the time. But, you know, the first time I noticed Daniel's writings was, I guess, almost a quarter of a century ago, when he did a book, which I think was an outgrowth of his dissertation, which is on slave soldiers. Which, if any of you know who know Islamic history, particularly medieval Islamic history, you know that is an incredibly important institution. And a very common institution, that wherever you have the evolution of Islamic societies, you have the introduction of slave soldiers as being members of the elite. It's a very hard thing for Western scholarship, I think, to deal with, even though it was so critical. Commentary on it, at least when I was following academic commentary, was not nearly as much as you would expect. I think one of those reasons is there was sort of just a discomfort about it. You saw the same thing much more clearly, for example, when you looked at Islamic feudalism. I mean, one of the reasons that you look at Anglo-American scholars spent a lot of time on Islamic feudalism is we were hunting. Whether you wanted to say so or not, you were hunting for those little building blocks that all of us from an Anglo-American tradition always have expected to see in our own history that led to democracy, that led to a greater open liberal society. Well, guess what? When you look into medieval Islamic history, you don't find them. You really don't. And there are lots of reasons for that, but let's just make it simple and say the histories are completely different. The notion that, in fact, you are going to have the same type of institutions develop, certainly over the same speed, that we had in Western society is false. It's just not going to happen. Democracy in the Middle East is going to be front-loaded. That means elections are actually going to come first. Institution building is going to come second. You are not going to have the dictators of the Middle East, I think, slowly allow you, or rapidly allow you, to sort of build up the liberal institutions that we've all gone to cherish, and these institutions are thereby going to push forward a more liberal society, and we're going to create Muslim liberals all over the place. I just don't think that's true. Now, you know, one of the reasons that perhaps the principal reason that I so admire President Bush is that President Bush, who obviously didn't have a background in Middle Eastern studies, nevertheless understood fairly quickly, and he made it crystal clear in November 2003, I think it was at the National Endowment of Democracy, that he understood that, in fact, the Middle East had become politically dysfunctional, and that through a perverse combination of tyranny, both suppressing and supporting Islamic radicalism, Islamic fundamentalism, we had given birth, helped to give birth, to bin Ladenism. I mean, that, I think, was a fairly profound observation on his part. There are others before who had, of course, had seen it. I think there was a growing awareness that the tyrannies in the Middle East had contributed to the growth of Islamic radicalism, that once upon a time, I think, had been the preserve of sort of left-wing commentators, but it had gradually moved in to other domains. And I would just say that I think the writings of people like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami were incredibly important, certainly in a post-9/11 world, for a lot of people to understand how this sort of perverse nexus had developed, and that we needed to change policy. We shouldn't go back. We shouldn't maintain that which we had done before, which was essentially maintaining or supporting the dictatorships in the Middle East, and certainly fearing whenever possible the Islamic bogeyman. That we were going to live with the dictatorships we had, because the possibility of the Islamists gaining power was too unacceptable. and we were not certainly going to allow democracy to be a vehicle for Islamists for toppling the regimes and thereby bringing about something worse. Now, again, I think we've fundamentally changed that view. I think that's true on the Republican side. I think that's true on the Democratic side. I think everybody now realizes that the systems in the Middle East are politically dysfunctional, and that we have to open them up. Now, there is a great debate going on inside of the administration. I think it's only going to grow in amplitude on whether the United States is going to, back an opening in the political systems, which will inevitably allow fundamentalist Islamic militants, activists, we use different terms to describe them, and in fact we should use different terms because one title does not fit all, to participate in the system. I think it's inevitable. I think it's inevitable because, one, they represent such a large number of people in the Middle East. If you go out in the Middle East and you just deal with those individuals that you would describe as liberals or progressives, you will usually find them in Middle Eastern conferences that Westerners usually sponsor, and that's about it. Now, can they grow? Sure, they can grow. But I just suggest to you that if you go to the Khan Khalili book market in Cairo, I mean, you can find various Arabic translations of great Western minds. People can read them if they want to. A lot of people have. However, you will find much more going in the other direction. And there is an issue. When you have, for example, in Cairo, when you have it in an elite institution like the American University of Cairo, the women of the affluent increasingly veiling themselves, that should tell you something. I mean, that should tell you these are women who do not have to do it because of peer pressure. They do not have to do it because of some political overlord. They are doing it to express, I think, in part, their contempt for the present political system. They are also reflecting, I think, what is a regrettable after effect of secular dictatorship in the Middle East, that secularism per se has a bad name. It has been attached to dictatorship. And I think if you were asking for someone, for example, like Sayyiduddin Ibrahim, I think all of you know, if you were to ask him, should you exclude these individuals, the vast majority of individuals, maybe not vast, but a significant chunk of the population from the political process, I think, one, I'm sure he would say no. He has said no. And two, he probably suggests that you're doing absolutely the worst thing possible for those who describe themselves as liberals and progressives. That you cannot, I think they cannot have legitimacy in the political system if they are in fact undermined by what may be a majority of the population, what may be a significant chunk, if not a majority of the intellectuals, and by the traditional clergy. And I just suggest to you, because a lot of this, you can't really make it empirical because we haven't gotten there. So we're making sort of intuitive leaps. But I suggest to you, if you think you're going to build democracy in the Middle East on sort of an Ataturkist approach, which is, and I think this is the approach that most Americans have had, both on the left, the right, realists all over the place. I think more or less this is what we're talking about here, is that you're going to build democracy in the Arab world through an enlightened dictatorship, bringing about greater secularism, and eventually, ushering in democracy. Now, I think we've already had the test case of that, certainly in the Arab world since the end of World War II, and we've seen the opposite happen. We've actually seen the dictatorships become less progressive, less liberal. We've seen what we would consider sort of the liberal indices of these societies diminish. I think that is, for those who believe in the Ataturkist evolution, I think that is the future. In fact, what you're doing, in all probability, is just you're going to encourage the growth of bin Ladenism. You have to have these people start to participate. If one were to make a Western parallel in this process, and again, it's a little crude and may be slightly unfair, is that, I mean, you don't get to have democracy, you don't get to have Thomas Jefferson unless you get Martin Luther. All right, and all of you who remember German history know that is a period of great turmoil. Now, we all hope, and I certainly do believe myself, that the trauma in the Middle East is going to be a lot less than, say, the Germans had to sustain a few centuries back. But you have to expect trauma. And you also have to expect that as democracy grows, in all likelihood, it will be built upon anti-Americanism in great part. It will certainly be built upon anti-Zionism. It's going to touch on many of those issues for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them you might say are historically, all of them are historically understandable. Some might even be legitimate. Some are unquestionably repugnant. But I think that is where we're probably going to go. I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it's highly likely that as democracy rises in the Middle East, as the movement continues, it's going to become a more anti-American movement. It's going to become a more anti-Zionist movement. I would say live with it. Don't get overwhelmed by it. It's definitely cause for concern. It is anxious, but it's part of the fever breaking. And that you don't really have the choice. I mean, mechanically, the United States really, the input that we have here, I think, is quite limited. I think there's certainly certain things we can do. I would, for example, be much more aggressive in Egypt. I think Egypt is the linchpin here. And I would make it very, very clear to Mubarak's regime that, in fact, if you want American aid, it is going to be hinged to more liberal openings and to democracy. And since the president of Egypt, unexpectedly, after calling democracy chaos, he changed gears and said, in fact, we could have democracy right away, even though I think some of us might suggest that election was perhaps just a bit odd. It certainly should encourage the United States to at least have the same standards and timetables as the Egyptian president. If he thinks democracy can happen right away, then so should we. And I would say you want the progress to move forward. You don't get to break this anymore. The genie's out of the bottle. And the worst case scenario that you can imagine is not, in fact, democracy growing with all the possibilities of militant abuse from the bottom up. That is where you want to go. I would argue that in the end, what you've got here and what's going to save the day is that Muslims are, in their reflexes, basically like most other people. There are differences. But in the end, I mean, one of the things about the confession of faith, if you've talked to Muslims about it, I mean, one of the reasons apostasy, for example, carries the death penalty is that as a rational man, as a rational believer, as man and woman, when you commit yourself to God, you are actually making a very rational act, a choice. That I think this process is actually going to be fundamental. I think if you look at religious commentary on this, you can see, in fact, the merging of democratic ideals slowly but surely, not with the greatest precision that we would like in the West, but in fact these ideas are beginning to percolate through the system and mix with what I would call their much older forms of Islamic identity. And that's what you want to see. And again, I would suggest to you that if you think you are going to be able to create or a liberal democratic system is going to come into being, when in fact an enormous chunk of the intellectual and religious classes are somehow excluded from this process, I think you're deceiving yourselves. It won't happen. Now, you can make another argument and just say you don't even want to go that way, that you want to go back to the status quo, and I think you're beginning to see what I might describe as a realist counterattack. That they don't even want to talk about democracy. They don't even believe that, in fact, the dictatorship is terribly connected to the evolution of bin Ladenism, Islamic radicalism. I think that's a very odd historical position to take, but you can see it. And that we just want to maintain the status quo, because not maintaining the status quo is too scary. Again, I suggest to you that, in fact, is much more likely to give you the worst case scenario, which are Islamic revolutions from the top down. And I don't think you want to go there. I don't think the reflex for these dictatorships, by the way, has not been to encourage liberals when they're under stress. The reflex for these regimes has, in fact, to go to the right and try to encourage Islamic fundamentalism and actually make it worse. It makes it more militant underneath. And that's the nexus that has to be cracked, is this perverse nexus between tyranny and Islamic militancy through both oppression and support. Unless you do that, I don't think you're going to get anywhere, and the only way you're going to do that is open up the political system so people have the chance to yell, debate, scream about what it means to be Egyptian, what it means to be Syrian, what it means to be Palestinian. Otherwise, I think we're in a dead end, and we're going to go right back to 9/11, and I'll stop there.
Good afternoon. Reuel was kind enough to praise my work and let me in turn Quote, my review of his 1997 work, Know Thine Enemy, written under his then pseudonym Edward Shirley, I called it a quite brilliant spies report, and not many CIA agents or ex-CIA agents get to be called a quite brilliant spy. I'd like to start by saying a few words about radical Islam and then going on to the question of the moment. There are many ways to describe this phenomenon. I would point out 4 characteristics. The first would be a devotion to implementing the Islamic law, the Sharia. Whether this be personal law, a law governing economic activities, judicial procedures, military affairs, Islamic law in its totality must be applied, and indeed more than its totality, in that the Islamists, the supporters of radical Islam, are looking to bring all of human life under the aegis of Islamic law, far more than traditionally was understood. Second would be the transformation of a personal faith into radical utopian ideology, so that what had been, strictly speaking, a religion is now, in the eyes of the Islamists, something far larger and more encompassing. That we can see the most pure example of it in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Every aspect of life was, in fact, brought under the scrutiny of the interpretation of the leadership. They use the state for coercive purposes. They want to expand their power. In these regards, not in detail, but in these regards, control of the state and expanding the state and using coercion, they much more resemble other totalitarian movements such as fascism and communism than they do other faiths such as Judaism and Christianity. Third attribute would be the rejection of Western influence. Not modernity, but Western influence. Dividing the world into 2 parts, the Islamic and the non-Islamic, rejecting as much of the outside world as possible, with significant exceptions, especially military and medical, but a hatred and loathing of the West. And fourth, a drive to power. The Islamists want power. This is an ideology that is to bring them to power. It's very important to make a distinction between radical Islam, the ideology, and Islam, the personal faith. Radical Islam derives from Islam, but is a misanthropic, misogynist, triumphalist, millenarian, anti-modern, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, terroristic, jihadistic, and suicidal version of it. If you can think of more adjectives, I'll be happy to incorporate them. Now, as to the topic at hand, I believe, in the first place, that the Islamist movement is a single whole that includes both violent and non-violent wings. They work together. They are part of the same phenomenon. In this regard, I think it's useful to look, on occasion, to the fascist and communist precursors. There were Italian communists in the political arena in Italy who did not use violence, who worked the political system. Then there were communists in Russia and China who very much did use violence. They're all part of the same movement, but they adapted to the local circumstances. There were communists in the United States. They didn't use violence, by and large. They tried to gain political support. In all these cases, you see a general movement that adapts itself to the circumstances at hand. And one finds something similar with radical Islam. So in Turkey, you have a radical Islamic movement that by and large has adapted to the political system. In Afghanistan, you see a radical Islamic movement that used violence as its base. It is important to note that the one forwards the other. They work somewhat symbiotically. It was noted to me that just in the last couple of days, the Muslim Brethren in Egypt, who lately have become political and nonviolent, were egging on the violence in Alexandria against Copts. Or conversely, in London, after the 7/7 bombings a few months ago, the non-violent Islamists made use of these bombings to forward their agenda. One also finds very often that the violent types come out of a milieu that is not radical. You need to get drawn into it, and the way you get drawn into it is through non-violence. So I think it's a mistake to see a significant difference between violent and non-violent, or to put it in more subjective terms, good and bad Islamists. From my point of view, they are all bad. They're all part of the same radical utopian movement. Second point would be that the anti-Islamist Muslims are indeed weak. They are fractured. They are inarticulate. They are scared. It is no doubt the moment for the Islamists to get their ideas across, whether it be on international television, in the local mosque, in the school. One finds over and over again that the Islamists, the ones with the radical agenda, are also the ones dominating the discussion. This, again, has similarities to, say, the late 1920s in Germany, or many countries where communists were active, that although numerically small, because of their devotion, their single-mindedness, their energy, their capabilities, their funding, they were in a position to have an outsized influence. And one finds that today. My estimate is that some 10 to 15% of Muslims are actively Islamist, want to live under the Sharia, under the Islamic law, but their presence is certainly much greater than that 1/8 would suggest. And the anti-Islamists, who are small in number, are basically absent at this time. But ultimately, they are the key to a solution. How can this current war, how can this current crisis in the Muslim world come to an end? Only in one way, I suggest to you. Only by Muslims rejecting radical Islam and accepting something in its stead. But there has to be something in its stead to beat radical Islam. There has to be an alternate, a modern, a moderate version of Islam to take its place. That version, admittedly, is almost absent today, but we will, I hope, see it developing. And if radical Islam is ever to be shunted aside, it must be shunted aside by this alternate interpretation. It is crucial. And part of its strength will come from us supporting, through funding, through other means, celebrating the power, the ideas, the thrust of the anti-Islamist Muslims. To leave them in the lurch and join and in some way forward the Islamists is a betrayal of them and what they stand for. Finally, about democracy. I endorsed the President's speech in November 2003 when he shunted aside 60 years of bipartisan American policy that had dwelt on stability and said, yes, it is time to move on. It is dysfunctional, no disagreement. I disagree, however, in a stringent way with the application of this policy. Yes, democracy, but not democracy now. Democracy eventually. Democracy, as we've learned from the historical record, is a slow and complex process. It took centuries in Britain. It took decades in the 20th century, and it will take decades in the 21st. Democracy is in effect counterintuitive. As Greek philosophers pointed out, it makes much more sense to have a king who is brilliant run the country than to have the demos, the crowd, the mob run it. It makes much more sense for the government to prohibit bad ideas than to permit them. It makes much more sense to have a centralized, virtuous power. And yet we have learned that virtuous power often, or inevitably, goes sour, and that despite its many faults and contradictions, democracy is the best approach. Democracy takes time to learn. It is a reflex which we who are born in the United States acquire early, but it's a reflex that peoples who have not experienced it, especially if they've lived under the totalitarian thuggery of someone like Saddam Hussein, don't know at all. It takes not months, but years or even decades to acquire the habits of democracy. I was dismayed, for example, to see that the interval between the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and the election for prime minister in Iraq was a mere 22 months. I would have liked to see 22 years. I would have liked to see our working with non-democratically elected individuals who would get control of the country, make sure that the security situation is firm, and then over time work towards expanding the participation of the population in the government. I'd like to see the learning of ideas such as the rule of law, minority rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, private property, These are fundamental building blocks of democracy, and if one simply leaps, as we have done in our sponsored elections in Iraq, to electing the prime minister, you miss all these. Furthermore, democracy should begin at the bottom. In municipal elections, they should begin with the legislature, not the executive. It's a slow, long process, and what we've seen is if you jump too far too fast, you in effect spoil it. That the wrong people come to power. In particular, these days, the Islamists, who I mentioned before, are the best organized, the best funded, with the most coherent ideology, are the ones to take advantage of it. We've seen it just recently in Afghanistan, we've seen it in Kuwait, we've seen it in Iraq, we've seen it to a lesser extent in Saudi Arabia, we've seen it in Lebanon, we're going to see it in the Palestinian Authority. Wherever you look in the Muslim world, you see this same problem. It was in Algeria 14 years ago. Same problem. So the last thing we want to do is enfranchise our most extreme enemies. The last thing we want to do is bring the Islamists to power. It is to the benefit of those countries, Muslim countries, and ourselves, to have the process go slow so that the muscles of democracy are built up, the habits are understood, the counterintuitive notions are become natural. And so, yes, democracy, but democracy slowly. Stability, although discounted by the president, is not complete without virtues. Stability is important too. We don't want to have a series of revolutions and wars in the Middle East that jeopardize the peoples of the region and ourselves. We need to do this slowly. So yes, democracy, but not now. And that means working with the people on our side, people who see the world as we do. And if they're few in number, and they are, then we take time. We should not urge this process forward too quickly. Thank you.
Well, it sounded like in the beginning that Daniel was actually making my case. I mean, where did Islamic radicalism grow since World War II? It grew under dictatorship. I think Daniel would agree with me on that point, that what you have now, is, again, he confirmed that you have a rather perverse nexus here. Now, I would suggest that what Daniel is suggesting in this slow growth of democracy, one, it's just not going to happen. I mean, I don't think you don't ideally get to have this situation. I don't think the Muslim world is going to let you have it. I don't think the spread of the democratic ethic is going to let you have it. Now, I would agree completely that under an ideal world, you would have a very, very slow growth of democracy, and you'd have American paternalism, or you might call it by a different name, imperialism, all over the place, because I think we can say the American track record on this is actually pretty good. But you don't get to have it. I mean, you're not going to have, and when I listened to what Daniel was saying, if I were Hosni Mubarak, I'd go, oh, goody, 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 goody. Because essentially, you're advertising for what he wants. He says, we're going to have slow growth, and I guarantee you, it's going to be slow. And I'm going to give you the little tiny things, particularly women's rights. I'm going to throw them out. I mean, now you come with me to an NGO and says, I'll advance women's rights, I'll take that money right away, because it doesn't fundamentally challenge the political system. We're going to have this really, and it's quite likely we will, we're going to have this really microeconomic approach to all this, because in microeconomic approaches, we aren't really going to get to anything terribly tense. But I don't think events are going to allow us to go that way. And I suggest to you before, I don't see the only way this is going to change, the only way you're going to have evolution here, and I'm all for supporting progressives and liberals. Find them, support them. But again, I suggest to you, I think the process here is going to be very, very difficult for you. Because every time you seriously try to support progressives and liberals, you are going to be checked. I guarantee you the regimes are going to check you in place. And so the only way that you can actually break the system open, and I think it's the side of history is on their side, I mean, they've got to move it, the United States can only do so much, is you're going to have to start with elections first. I don't think you get to avoid it. And it's going to be the election process which is going to blow this open. Now, is that unsettling? You bet it is. As I said before, and I started off, I mean, anyone who comes from a medievalist background, which is where both Daniel and I come from, we much prefer to see the slow growth. I mean, we have learned to esteem the slow growth. We get very uncomfortable when we don't see all these liberal institutions because we know how very important they are. But I think you have to admit that in Islamic society, Islamic history, and certainly the modern history of the Middle East since World War II isn't going to give it to you. All right? However, the democratic ethic is out there. Now, is it imperfectly imbibed? Absolutely. But it is out there and it's growing. And again, I think you have to set up you have to support a process where you allow some evolution, where you essentially are not the handmaidens of dictators attempting to maintain the rule.
So far as I understand it, Reuel's rebuttal of me is to say, good luck, it's not going to happen. But my point was not to predict what will happen, it was rather to suggest what U.S. policy should be. I don't think we should adopt policies which encourage our enemies and help them achieve power. Maybe they will. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's out of our hands at this point. But I'm not sure it is. And your allusion to Hosni Mubarak taking glee at my recommendation suggests that you don't think that he thinks it's out of his power. So let's assume that it's not already foregone that the Islamists are going to take power, and let's figure out what we want. Do we want elections which, I think we're agreed, will bring them to power, or don't? Don't we want those? I'd say no. We want to go slow. We want to wait years. We want to develop these democratic muscles. And if it gets out of hand, it gets out of hand. But let's try and encourage it to go slow. Let me note also that many of Reuel's ideas come out of the contrast between the Iranian and the Algerian experiences. He notes correctly that Iran today has a population that is far more friendly to us than the Algerian one. In Iran, they had their Islamic Revolution, and a quarter of a century later, they're not so happy about it. In Algeria, there is anger against the United States, as in much of the Muslim world, in part due to the suppression that we did not contest of the elections in 1992. Well, that's true. But I don't think it's the proper basis for developing American policy, because while Iran does have a population more friendly to us, I need hardly point out that the government of Iran is more aggressive and more dangerous to us than that of Algeria. I think we would have been much better off had there never been an Iranian Islamic Revolution. We're much better off that there never was an Algerian one. I would rather see today's dictators, Hosni Mubarak et al., in power than tomorrow's Islamist dictators in power. I have no love lost for today's dictators, but at least they're without a burning radical utopianism. At least they are just sort of military officers who are trying to control their regime as opposed to creating a new world order along radical Islamic lines.
Thank you. Is this on? Let me just do this. Thank you to both of you. Usually, before the start of the question and answer, the moderator says, please keep your questions short. But I would like you to actually make some comments, and because I know there are a lot of people in the audience who are spending a lot of time thinking and writing about these issues. So you don't have to keep your questions short. And what I'd like you to do, though, is to please identify yourself before you ask your questions. So would like to, please.
Come up in January, that is elections in the Palestinian Authority and a question of Hamas participation. As you know, the administration's position is that ultimately Hamas is not a compatible democracy and something needs to be done about it ultimately. But for now, the administration does not really oppose the participation of Hamas in the elections. They say that this is up to the Palestinians to devise their own elections. And I would like to hear your comments, because on the one hand, clearly Hamas meets all your four criteria and also is of the violent variety. On the other hand, it's also an organization that has support of up to 40% of the population, massive support of the Palestinian population. So I'd like to hear your comments on the participation of Hamas in Palestinian elections.
I think the fact that the president did not take a strong stand on Hamas participation points to the logic of his own position. If you're in favor of elections and elections now, it's very hard to say that a party that potentially has 40% of the vote should be proscribed. I think that is a compelling reason for not having elections now. That we are not eager to see this kind of organization or Hezbollah in Lebanon take part and be legitimated by the elections. Let me add another point, that the President and Secretary of State have both proposed what I've dubbed the pothole theory of democracy, that Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, being so busy with governance, with maintaining schools and fixing roads, they will lose their appetite for murder and for spreading their ideology. In rebuttal, I would simply note that Mussolini was famous for making the trains run on time, and Hitler was famous for building the Autobahn, so that need not be something that stops them.
Easy if we stay down there and get up back and forth. Yeah, I'd say this. I mean, obviously this is for the Palestinians to decide. I mean, as a general rule, I think it ought to be a good idea if you were running your political systems, you would say that individuals who are engaged in terrorism should be, I would prescribe them from the political process. However, if the Palestinians don't want to do that, then Hamas should participate. And I would say that with Hamas, and I would say that with Hezbollah. I don't think you can stop them. I mean, what the present position we now have is just politically perverse. And that, in fact, you are going to continue to strengthen Hamas if you do not open up the political system. I don't think there's a more corrupt political system in the Middle East than the Palestinian system. I mean, it's just an awful situation. I think Fatah has to open up. Fatah has to evolve. Unless it goes that way, I don't see anything happening. So if they want, if the Palestinians as a people want Hamas to participate in that process, let them participate.
Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Far be it from me to try to promote consensus, but not that that would be possible in any case. But let me suggest this. Is it not possible to say, all right, your ideology is not our concern, but certain facts are, so that if you want to be, if you're Islamist and you want to participate, there are two requirements. One is you can't be simultaneously a political party and an armed militia. We can't have one political party in an election that has weapons, so you must get rid of your weapons before you can participate. And a second prerequisite would be this, that you would say you must agree beforehand in the concept of voter sovereignty. If you say voter sovereignty only applies if they elect Islamists, voters can put you in office, but they can't turn you out, since that is that would be blasphemous for voters to take from Allah that decision. Then you also can't participate. So you can participate if you agree upon those two things: no weapons, you're not an armed militia, and you agree to the concept of voter sovereignty. And just as part of that, haven't we seen something like that evolve already in Iraq, in that you have Islamist parties who clearly would prefer the imposition of Sharia everywhere, but in order for, in particular, for the Shia to have an agreement with the Kurds, they have agreed that Sharia will be an alternative, not the only alternative, that Islam will be a source and not the source, in which case you are seeing a sort of modification of radical Islamism.
Again, I mean, I think those rules that you have articulated are fine, except I'm not sure how pertinent they are for the United States. I mean, because again, we're not up there sort of clearing everybody. It's going to be for the Lebanese to decide. It's going to be for the Palestinians to decide. It's going to be for the Iraqis to decide. So, do I think that's a very good idea that that you say very clearly that if you are a militia and you're using terrorism, then you shouldn't be allowed to participate in the political process. I might agree with that, though. In Iraq, that's a little confusing because there are many armed militias who do a very noble purpose in keeping their people alive. So I would probably pull back from that one. But on that notion, on the one of sort of saying, I hereby swear that if I get elected, I'll leave the elections next time. I mean, that sort of goes with the terrain. I mean, I mean, so what if they swear it? I mean, I would agree with Daniel on this when they could pledge it all they wanted and they could still betray it. I just think that it is going to become, or is already, very, very difficult for people if they enter the political process from the bottom up. It's much easier to go from the top down. I mean, we can all remember that the Shah did not fall through a democratic process. He threw for revolution. And it's in fact that which you should fear the most. Because if Islamists can take power from the top down, then you do not have any democratic spirit operating inside the system. I would suggest also that the collapse of jihadism in Iran, which has been profound, it's certainly been one of the great movements, I would say, in modern Islamic history, I argue would have even happened quicker if it had been under a democratic system, and we would have probably seen something like that occur in Algeria. But we don't know. I mean, this is intuition. It's a guessing game. I'm just suggesting is that the present system is not healthy, and it gave us 9/11, and you should move away from it.
2 points. First, no, we don't vet the organizations that may or may not participate, but we do certainly have a voice. Look at the president's lack of attempt to keep Hamas out. That was certainly an important factor. The Israelis are looking at it very seriously. We obviously had an important role in the definition of who's acceptable in Iraq. So while not in all cases having a decisive voice, we do often have an influential voice. Leave it there.
Stephen Schwartz from the Center for Islamic Pluralism. Since you asked for convoluted, I'm going to try to keep it limited, but I agree with both of you. I don't really see much of a disagreement here. I think both of you are on the side of the angels here, on the side of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would say. But to Reuel, I would suggest that Daniel is going closer to what I think is a better paradigm, which is the paradigm of religion, which means tradition and even conservatism, versus radicalism, where it seems to me you're looking more in terms of a paradigm of conservatism versus liberals and progressives. And I just wondered if either of you would address that. I was just in Indonesia, and I was struck by the fact that there is such a split. In Indonesia, they talk about conservative Muslims versus liberal Muslims. In Singapore, they talk about traditional Muslims versus radical Muslims. The other point I wanted to ask is provoked by being in Indonesia and Singapore. To what extent do you think it's relevant to try to move, at least temporarily, the area of action away from the Arab East and to the countries which in Islamic history were in fact tremendously important countries, which means Turkey, Iran, possibly Morocco, Central Asia, where some sort of process is going on, and, for example, Indonesia.
Well, the first one was to you.
Listen, I mean, I'm all for traditional religious experience, and I would that Al-Azhar in Cairo were what it once was. And I would say its decline has been it used to be a great bulwark against Wahhabism, against Salafism. It is no longer. Now, there are many reasons for that, but certainly an important reason has been the corruption of the entire process because of the corrupt dictatorship in Egypt, since increasing corrupt dictatorship in Egypt, where in fact, Al-Azhar has been used by the state, and and you combine that with the injection of huge quantities of Saudi money, has in fact turned an institution of traditional faith into, and I would argue in many cases, an institution of radicalism. I don't see how you're ever going to find out whether the traditionalists are going to be able to hold their ground unless you actually have some type of democratic system developed. I think under the current system, what is happening is radicalism is growing much more powerfully, much more rapidly under dictatorship than traditionalism. I think traditionalism is collapsing. I think only through the democratic process are you going to have a chance for traditionalism to regain the spiritual high ground inside of Muslim societies. And I just suggest again, until you cannot exclude the clergy from this process. If you attempt to exclude the Kyrgyz on the Shiite side or the Sunni side, you are going to lose. There is not going to be any Ataturk parallel in the Arab world here. It's just going to make the situation worse. On the issue of geographic, very quick words. I mean, Bernard Lewis put it a long time ago that with the fall of the Soviet Union, that you were going to see a rebirth of what you might call the Islamic equator is going to go north. And it's going to reestablish itself along what was the case from about the 9th, 10th century, where in fact it is the northern countries that are the dominant countries in the Muslim world. That all may happen, but it's somewhat irrelevant to bin Ladenism. And that wherever bin Ladenism is generated is where you're going to keep your eyes focused because they can hurt you.
I would take issue with the idea that democracy is an inoculation against radical Islam. And my proof would be looking at the countries of the West. To take the 4 London bombers as a prime example, there was nothing undemocratic about their experience. And more broadly, looking at Western countries, one sees that in flourishing democracies, one has a rapid and extreme and rapid growth, luxuriant growth of radical Islam. So I'm dubious that democracy is the antidote to radicalism. On the second question about geography, I'm with Reuel there. The Middle East has long been the center of Islam for historical and other reasons, including these days that's where the money is. Just as the Chileans can develop new ideas about personal social security accounts and that we will learn from, so can Egyptians learn from Indonesians, but it's the odd influence that works that way. By and large, will influence Chile and Egypt will influence Indonesia rather than the other way around.
Thank you. I'm Steve Clemens of the New America Foundation. I guess my question, I'm surprised I'm saying this because I'm very familiar with Daniel Pipe's work, but I think Brent Scowcroft in the current issue of the New Yorker would largely agree, or seem to have agreed, and actually had very serious fights with Condoleezza Rice and the administration. In January when he spoke, you may recall that he also talked about the elections and the various circumstances in a circumstance of incipient civil war. And I guess Reuel's a friend, and I'm very, very taken because I know that there's a realist deep in there, but you seem to be saying we need to roll the dice with these democracies. In Algeria, over a decade ago, that was tried, and Islamists were on their way into government, and things came undone. And I'm interested in terms of a metaphor that frames for you and for others that look at elections and democratic process in these regions where you think inclusion of radical Islamist factions can make sense if they want it. I think you're saying we don't have much latitude over it anyway, but step beyond that a little bit. Do you think if the Islamists were to participate, would it temper behavior? Would you see them as Daniel said, as sort of flaming ideological zealots in that circumstance anyway, and pervert the institutions of democracy, their direction? And I'd like you just to step a little bit forward out of we don't have much influence over this process, to what you think might happen if you began to see more and more examples of this occurring. Would we get some sort of balance in this stability, or would we get the Daniel Pipe Scowcroft nightmare that we end up with far worse circumstances in the entire region than we have if we made alternative bets?
I'm not the biggest fan of the idea that through a quick injection of democracy that radicals become moderates. Now there are such things as fallen Islamic holy warriors and fallen Islamic activists. I mean, I've met them, I've seen them, they do happen. Iran is chock full of them. And as we all know, there are such things as fallen communists. I mean, as some wit might say, where would neoconservatism be if that weren't true? But that's not why, I think this is a good idea. I mean, you have to have a sort of a basic, I suppose, in this, a basic faith, as you do in the West. You're going to have it in the Muslim world, is that the vast majority of Muslims aren't going to do something stupid. And that I think what is essential here is that they have the chance to grow and evolve. I mean, Daniel wrote a very good book on conspiracy theories in the Muslim world. And anyone who's been in the Muslim world knows how incredibly important they are for just normal discourse, let alone high discourse. They define often debates. Well, I don't see that process changing until people actually take control of their lives and they are responsible for it. And we haven't seen anything to make us believe that's going to be the case with dictatorship in the Middle East. I mean, we should have seen more evolution the other way. What we're asking ourselves now is right now it's going to reverse, that we're actually going to start having enlightened despots. I doubt it. I just don't see it. I mean, we're going to give it a try now. I think the administration is definitely moving towards that course. What you might call sort of, nudging dictators and sort of let's see if we can have one more rule at the Ataturkist rule and push it a little bit more, but that they can, in fact, bring about a more open liberal system. Well, we're going to have the test. I don't think it's probably going to work. I think that we are that going down the path of supporting the dictatorships, of seeing them continue, you're likely to get vastly more instability in the Middle East over the long run. You're certainly going to encourage bin Ladenism, which is the last thing we want to do. I think you're going to have to go down that process. I think the Muslims are going to take you down that process, whether you want it or not, and you're going to see this thing roll. I don't think, I think Algeria is an interesting case. I mean, it's by no means clear to me that, Fis would have been triumphant if the process had gone all the way through. I don't know. I mean, they were beginning to peak a little bit and go down. But I do know that I actually took the opposite position back in 1991, so I'm arguing against myself. But I think the aftershocks of that were pretty bad. And I think the aftershocks of radicalizing the Algerian networks in Europe were very bad. And if you look at these Algerian networks and how they've grown, it certainly should give you pause. And I would rather have seen them participate in that process go through. Do I think it's going to moderate the worst case ones? Many of them, absolutely not. I don't think anything on earth would have moderated bin Hajj. I mean, that man is just poison. But it's going to force people to compete. And I do think in that process of competition that you do have the possibility for evolution. And if you deny that political evolution can occur with the vast majority of Muslims, then I think you've just driven right into a cul-de-sac.
Reuel rightly worries about bin Ladenism in the opposition. But I worry that his ideals will bring bin Ladenism into power.
We've been talking a lot today about how to build democracies, and I want to put on the table that we might actually learn something about that, about when we know why democracies break down. We've been talking a little bit about elections and voting that way, and I think we all know by now that democracy is not merely rule of the majority, but it's the protection of the minority. And so in some ways I have a question I'd like to pose to you about, yes, voting, but into what? Into what system do we get where we are assured that the voting is, that voting leads to people who will protect a minority? We know that democracies break down frequently when they fail to provide security and economic activity. We know that from the interwar period in Europe. We know that a little bit from Russia in the past 10 years or so in that question there. And so in some ways, I think the challenge for us is that when we're dealing with coming out of dictatorships, and we saw this in the post-communist world, the assumption would be that the state would somehow step back. We need to have strong, I think, democrats come in, people who can provide security, people who can provide the conditions for economic activity to flourish. And so in some ways, I want to ask the question almost flipped that way. We've seen some democracies break down. How can we ensure that democracies we build will last? Oh, really?
All right. Listen, I mean, again, this gets back to what I was opening with. I mean, in Islamic history, I mean, the notion of minority is dhimma. All right? And I don't care how you slice it, cut it, look at it. You don't come from a dhimma status to what we would call as a Western protection of minority rights. All right? You are talking about evolution here, and that evolution is there. I mean, as I have quipped before, I mean, when the British first introduced in a rather radical act of imperial hubris the idea that slavery was no longer vouchsafed to you by God, there were a lot of Muslims who looked at you and thought the Brits had lost their minds. Because slavery is vouchsafed to you by God. You can find it in the Quran, you can find it in the Holy Law. Now, today, what was that, 1807, move it forward, how many years later, I think it's fair to say that outside of little tiny slices of Mauritania, Chad, and maybe a big slice of Saudi Arabia, most Muslims don't believe that slavery is now vouchsafed to them by God, that there has been this evolution. I suggest the only way that you're going to build up the ethic of, in fact, minority protection, minority rights, is through the practice of it. You don't get to have it just sort of theoretically dropped into your mind and it springs out like Athena from Zeus's head. Unless you work at it, I don't think you get to have it. And could it go wrong? Absolutely. Like I said before, I mean, Daniel can go on this, I can go on all the problems that, for those of us who have a long sort of look at Islamic history, it causes you a great deal of anxiety. But I think you also have to appreciate the amount of evolution. I mean, we've certainly seen in the Middle East, the one thing the Middle East has been very, very good at is its absorptive capacity. I mean, it's absorbed every single bad idea the West has ever put out. Just swallowed it, hook, line, and sinker. Now, the issue is whether the good ideas can quite have the same traction. I think the fact we're moving in that direction. But is it going to be an upsetting and perhaps ugly process? I'd bet lots of money on it.
As Reuel kindly noted, I do have a book on slavery. And it strikes me that slavery today has a rather more prominent position than you would give it. Not only is slavery there in Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and elsewhere, but more importantly, it has never been confronted as an issue. There has been no process by which Muslim thinkers, politicians, journalists, academics have come to the conclusion that slavery is no longer acceptable. And indeed, there was a statement by a leading figure in Saudi Arabia, I can't give you his name offhand, but within the last year or two, in which he said, if you do not believe in slavery, you are not a Muslim. So the whole catharsis that we in this country, for example, went through in rejecting slavery has not even begun in the Muslim world. You're right that on a day-to-day basis there are very few slaves per capita in the Muslim world. But in terms of modernization, no. There's another aspect of that. Another feature that's worthy of note is riba, is interest on money. While most Muslims have interest-bearing accounts of some sort or other, there has been no discussion of this issue and coming to the conclusion that the interest of a few percentage points per year is acceptable. 25% a week is not, but a few percent a day, a year is acceptable. And so what we have are the development of major financial institutions. Last I saw, estimated over $150 billion worth, that are dealing in interest-free finances. Again, as in slavery, no attempt to come to terms with what usury is and is not. And these and in many other ways, larger ways, having to do with women, having to do with minorities, having to do with the family, having to do with governance, the judicial system, the Muslim world has not modernized, has not come to terms with modern life. It's simply ad-libbing its way through. And it is this confrontation with the ideas of modernity, not just the practices, that yet awaits the Muslim world, and that I think in large part those who are arguing against the Islamist project must undertake. So I'm far more pessimistic than you. I don't see this having really begun at all.
I mean, there is a great diversity within the Islamist political parties, from those who want to establish Sharia strictly, to those who have liberal views, to those who espouse a more pragmatic view. They're willing to, to apply some part of Sharia, but not all. And I think that should really inform some kind of policy on how to engage Islamists. The second assumption is that the movement of moderates or renewal within the Muslim world is really weak. I mean, the debate on some of the issues about minority rights, women, democracy are going on. They are serious debates. If you look at within Europe, in the United States, in Asia, there is a lot of discussion about these issues, so it's not something that is really weak, isolated. It's more like how to expand the debate, how to, to support it. It's not like it's, absent. And the third is about this question of violence. I think outside of the Palestinian situation or Lebanon, most of the Islamist political parties that have accepted to participate in the political process, the question of violence is mute. I mean, they do not uphold arms. So I think we should be careful not to apply the situation in Gaza or Hamas to the Party for Justice and Development in Morocco or other areas where they are willing to participate in the political process.
Thank you for the three critiques. On the question of Islamists being diverse, well, I started by saying that. I drew the comparison with the communists in Italy and the communists in Russia. Very diverse. I mentioned Turkey, I mentioned Afghanistan. Certainly Tayyip Erdogan is a different figure from Osama bin Laden. There's no doubt that we all understand that there is enormous diversity. Your second point, that the debate on issues is going on and is serious. Well, I just gave you the example of slavery and riba, where I don't think it's going on, I don't think it's serious. Let me take you another example. Let me take the notion of jihad. Sooner or later, the Muslim world is going to have to come to terms with the notion of jihad, which is a deeply aggressive, violent form of war against non-Muslims in order to control land. It is nothing else. That's what it's always been, well, it's what it's always been. Need not always be. Always been until now. What we see today are apologetics. Well, no, it doesn't really mean that. It's defensive war. But really it means becoming a better person, working for against apartheid and for feminism. That's not a serious debate. The debate on jihad hasn't even begun. So I don't think what I see reaches the point of what you call serious. And the third question of violence, that most Islamists have accepted nonviolent means. Well, you did yourself mention the Palestinians and the Lebanese. One can think of many others. The Iraqis come right to mind, in Afghanistan, Pakistan. I don't think by any means that's a far-reaching conclusion that Islamists have drawn. I think rather it's a matter of what works in which circumstances. In a well-established democracy, you don't use violence. That's not the way to get to power. But in a more fluid environment, violence is certainly one of the tools that are available to you, and the Islamists make use of it.
Mark Platten, Journal of Democracy. For Dan Pipes, I'm really confused now as to how you would characterize the overall Muslim community's views, or the Muslim electorate, or would-be electorate. On the one hand, you say only 10 or 15% are Islamist or radical Islamist, which you seem to use Islamist to mean radical Islamist, if I'm understanding you correctly. But then you seem to also suggest that anywhere where there are elections, the Islamists would win, which seems odd given the small percentage. Now, you do say how much better organized they are, how much more vital ideologically they are, but that presumably has something to do with the fact of operating under repressive conditions. It's easier for them, a well-organized group such as they are, to act. And it's also not clear to me where you put traditional Muslims in this continuum, or how you would regard the various parties in Iraq, whether you consider them, is the Ayatollah Sistani an Islamist, or so I wonder if you could just clarify some of that.
In terms of terminology, I use the word radical Islam and Islamism as synonyms. So radical Islamist is someone who supports Islamism or radical Islam. I don't really make a distinction between radical Islamists and moderate Islamists. That's something I tried to reject at the beginning, saying it's a matter of circumstance rather than good and bad. People we can work with and people we can't, which is, by the way, U.S. government policy, that we can work with the good Islamists and not work with the bad ones. In terms of why if the Islamists are by and large 1/8 of the population, are they likely to win elections? Well, because of a variety of circumstances. You alluded to one. They're being organized and having a program. Being honest, in large part, wins them. Being hardworking, providing services, has won them significant support. Turkey would be a model case. It is a democracy now for half a century. the Islamists probably don't number more than 15%, yet they have won elections with more than twice that vote because the other parties have discredited themselves, have bickered among themselves, can't form large enough units to get into parliament, and so the Islamists dominate in Turkey. And by the way, Zaino is the expert on this, not me, but the prospect is there that if the opposition parties continue to bicker, there could be, for what I would think to be, you're the expert on democracy, the first time in history, a legitimate democratic election in which one party is 100% of the parliament, because all the other parties are under 10% and therefore can't get access to the Turkish parliament. I mean, that would be an extreme case where something in the order of 1/8 of the population completely dominates the parliamentary and therefore much else life in Turkey. I think it goes a long way, being organized, being coherent, having a program of ideas, having money. These are the tools by which one wins elections.
You just follow the experience in Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. Pakistan doesn't really seem to back up that notion. I mean, the real Islamist parties who ran there tended to get under 10%.
You're right that places in which Islamists have not done particularly well, by and large that was historical, and they aren't tending to do better these days. There are also many cases, I think of Jordan, for example, where the authorities have done their best to repress the Islamist vote using all sorts of mechanisms. It is potentially an attractive force, as is any body of ideas and group of people who stand for something, and who are bold in its articulation, and who make substantial promises, and who disdain the existing system and offer something quite different. We've seen historically, not just with the Islamists, but with fascist and communist parties, that this is a draw. I would not consider Sistani Islamist, no.
Nina Shea, Director of the Center for Religious Freedom at Freedom House. I'm wondering what role you think funding of Islamists, radical Islamists, plays in subverting democracy at this time. We see in Iraq the parties that were the strongest and did the best in the election were the big religious parties that were funded out of Iran. In the Sunni world, you have Saudi Arabia funding the ideology, funding the textbooks, funding movements. Is that an important factor that the United States must confront before it can continue, I guess, Reuel, its push for democracy? Or, I mean, not before, but simultaneously, since it's already pushing for democracy. Is it something that would make a huge difference to cut off the funding, if it were able to cut off the funding to these groups? And Dan, I'd like your comment on that too.
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, it'd be hard to find something that has done more damage to the Islamic world than the dual funding, competitive funding of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran, I think, has for the most part failed. I mean, I don't really think it's, if you look historically, we'll still see whether its chances in Iraq are all that good. I don't think they will be. But really, it's had one child, and that child is the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Otherwise, I don't think the Iranians have had much success. The bang for the buck hasn't been terribly good. Now, Saudi Arabia, that's different, and they certainly have poured more money into it. I mean, it's impossible to overestimate the damage that the export of Wahhabism has done to traditional Islam in the Middle East. It's just impossible to overestimate it. However, with that said, I'm not sure how the United States deals with that. I really don't. I've thought about this, and I've talked to people who think about this all the time. Mechanically, I don't see how the United States can counter a state that has so much oil wealth. I mean, would that Saudi Arabia were in everybody's mind and we treated it like Burma. Because, I mean, there is no real reason why so many Westerners are so close to the Saudis and spend a lot of time with them and socialize with them and make defenses of them and all the rest. I mean, it's surreal. The only reason that's so is oil. However, they have an awful lot of it. And I don't know. I mean, I'm still waiting for someone to give me how you do the battle of ideas against someone who is so wealthy. And they have much better networks than anybody else. I think it would be nice to get the rhetorical pulpit right in the United States. And I give the Bush administration credit. I think it is moving in that direction. I don't think the Saudis enjoy quite the same position now than they did before. But I'd like to see a lot more rhetorically. But more than that, I'm confounded by how you compete against that effectively. And maybe Daniel has an idea.
Hybrid engines.
Molly McHugh, the American Enterprise Institute. I have a question, or two questions actually. One following up on a point Reuel made earlier about the U.S. continuing to support dictators, really doing more to encourage bin Ladenism than otherwise. It's definitely true that the support of non-democratic processes, be it supporting dictators for reform or whatever else, seems that it would be more impossible now than it would have been before. In the Middle East, a lot of what we hear and a lot of the sentiment that's generated anti-Americanism has been from our lack of support for democracy. People who are frustrated that we're not standing up for reformers, people who are frustrated that we're not standing up for the more progressive movements. Moving a bit further afield to the Arab world, if you look at Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim state in the post-Soviet area for sure, there was a headline after the last presidential election in one of the reformer newspapers that said, if the U.S. backs such a way in Azerbaijan, then God bless bin Laden. And that would be part of or an example of the sort of the sentiment against the United States not standing up for democracy and seeing Islam as the only other alternative to dictatorship. Or their current dictatorships. And I was wondering if you both could comment on that. And a second point that I'm just sort of interested to get your views on. There's been a lot of discussion of moderate Islam and the role that creating sort of a new definition of a lot of how we understand Islam could have in countering bin Ladenism. But a lot of that also means looking to places where there's a large Sufi presence, and there's really hasn't been a resolution between whether or not or between Sufis and the rest of the Islamic world as to what their role is and if they're actually Muslim. And I was wondering if you could comment on how you overcome that and what role Sufis could have.
Oh, come on, you don't want to take the Sufi question? Well, since I have a Sufi near me right now. I think, unfortunately, the Sufis have had a hell of a time. I mean, there's one problem. I mean, Sufis, with some historical exceptions, have been, what do you want to call it, practitioners of peace politics. I mean, some exceptions. There are some such things as Sufi holy warriors, but their track record. I mean, when you have soft power slam into hard power, let me tell you, soft power loses in the Middle East. So I would like to hope and like to believe that the Tariqat movements will have profound influence on the transformation and pushing forward a moderate democratic Islam. Maybe they might. I haven't seen it yet, but I'll remain hopeful. I mean, in the competition, look at Iraq. I mean, that's an interesting case. Now, that's an extreme case, but I mean, I'll use it anyway. That the competition that exists between the Sufis, and there was a very powerful Sufi movement, Sunni Sufi movement in Iraq, and the Salafis is not going very well for the Sufis right now. They take cover. And I don't see that changing. I think the facts on the ground are going to work against the Sufis. That's not to say that behind the scenes that general spirit, temperament, sentiment cannot have an overwhelming influence eventually if the political system holds and you get to vote. But we'll have to see. I mean, it's too soon. On the earlier question, I mean, just very quickly put, I mean, there are lots of different reasons why Islamic militants hate the United States. Lots. I certainly think the factor that you hear often amongst the militants themselves of American support for dictatorships is one that should worry you. And that the United States needs to adjust, and I think it is adjusting. I think we have seen with the Bush administration, I think it will continue to any following administration, whether it's Democratic or Republican, that you have now seen the United States correct the anomaly in its foreign policy. And that anomaly is that every place else, fitfully, hypocritically, nevertheless, we have supported democracy every place else except the Middle East, even in Africa, I think more enthusiastically. I think that has now changed, and I don't think we're ever going to go back to the position where we were before 9/11. I think all administrations from this time forward, be they Democrat or Republican, there may be differences of means, differences of tone, etc., are going to continue to support the idea of dictatorship, of democracy in the Middle East. Whether that has a profound effect on the radical movement, we'll see. Proof is in the pudding. Just the simple rhetoric of the United States on this issue, I don't think is going to be sufficient to dissuade young men who are going to make that leap of faith into holy warriorism.
There's a conspiracy theory in the Middle East of great strength that it is American support for regimes such as the one in Egypt that allows them to stay in power. And therefore, the anger against the regime is directed towards us. I don't think that were the regime to change, as, for example, it did spectacularly in Iraq, we would get credit for it. So it's a mug's game. We can't lose any way we do, and I wouldn't try and appease that sentiment.
Dave Kaplan from U.S. News. I think my question was already asked about the Saudis, but I'm not sure you guys answered it, so let me ask it again. What do you do with the state that's pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into tilting the playing field when you're moving in a process of democratization? Daniel, I'd especially like to hear you on this. I mean, what do we do about the Saudi factor as we move forward? Whether we're supporting hardcore regimes that are anti-democratic, or we're supporting democratizing republics.
Well, as Reuel alluded, we have a special relationship with Riyadh. It is the only, to the best of my knowledge, relationship where many of the important actors on the American side are working in collusion with their friends on the other side. The U.S.-Saudi relationship reminds me, say, of the French-Iraqi or the German-Iranian, where a handful of people who representing commercial interests basically disregard the strategic interests of the country. And that is the sad case in the United States vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabian regime, going back really 60 years now. It is ex-presidents and ex-senators and ex-flag officers and ex-ambassadors and others who are key to this. The Congress has never played a significant role. The press, the lobbies, nobody can puncture this. Now, there's been a little bit of vulnerability since 9/11, but not all that much. So until we have robust representation of our interests vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, I don't think much is going to happen. And that, in turn, requires a different approach. I've advocated for a few years now that there be, as in the case of, say, insurance commissioners, they may not go work for the insurance companies. There's revolving door legislation. So ex-presidents and ex-senators and ex-flag officers and ex-ambassadors and their staff may not go to work for the Saudis 10 years after they've dealt with them in office. And then maybe we'll have the beginnings of an attempt on the side of our government to deal with these issues, which until now are simply not being addressed.
My name is Reuel Marc, I'm from the Embassy of Egypt, and my comments are just from an intellectual perspective, not necessarily to comment on some of the things that were mentioned about the government of Egypt. This debate that's taking place here is of course, very interesting, and we have a very similar debate taking place back home in Egypt regarding the role of Islamists in political life and the future of Egypt. Of course, understandably, your perspective is that of American interests, and where does America's interest lie in this equation? Naturally, of course, back home, the debate is based on what is best serving Egypt's interests. As you mentioned, some people who are supposed to be the liberals and the progressives in society have taken a very strict position on any participation for Islamists under any name or title, whether under a political party, guys, or even as individuals running as independents. And on the other hand, there are people who say, no, it has to be a liberal, open competition between anybody who is willing to play by the rules of the game. in the healthiest form of this debate, at least there is this debate taking place right now, in its healthiest form, some people have reached some kind of consensus or agreement based on the following. You need to have a process. This process will lead to one of two outcomes. One of them, either those who simply go out and say Islam is the solution and nothing beyond that will be exposed. They don't have anything more, and people will start realizing that this is the extent of what they can offer. Or some people will be reformed, and there are specific cases of people who beforehand were absolutists coming from a religious theological background, presuming that they will go into parliament and apply Islamic tenets and canons and rules and say this is the way it's going to be, but they realized through actually participating in a process that it wasn't that simple. I can even give one specific example. The head of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood right now, Muhammad Mahdi Akif, was a member of parliament in the early 90s. And he acknowledged that publicly. He said, he was asked, how was your experience in parliament? He said, I walked in, I thought everything was going to be easy, we were going to dominate politics, and then we realized we had to, get into political activity, horse trading, things of the sort. So that is one case of someone who was actually reformed by the process, and there are, I'm sure, examples of other people who will be, exposed for what they are, simplistic people. My problem is that when you mentioned that 10-15% of the population in at least Egypt or other countries see themselves as Islamists, in the broader term, I think a much higher percentage of those people at this time think they are affiliated to some kind of Islamic ideology. That is because they don't know exactly what it is. Perhaps when there is a process that takes place that allows them to judge those participants in political activity, the percentage might actually go down. Last point, this is what we're trying to do right now. We are not allowing in Egypt political parties legally based on a religion, on Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. But what they're allowing in the process right now is participation. You can run, just don't hold a banner saying you're the Islamic Party of Egypt. Run as an independent. And then perhaps that's a transitional period to see how things evolve at a later term. I'm not saying anybody has the final word on it, but it's still a work in progress, and we're in an evolutionary stage, very early evolutionary stage, and hopefully we'll try to reach some kind of satisfactory conclusion of this. But we don't have a full answer, and I'd like to hear if you have any comments on that.
I just want to say that I vacation a lot in Egypt, so despite my mean comments that I make about the Egyptian regime, I hope they continue to be hospitable to me. Okay. We'll see. I think the evolution is certainly, Daniel and I would disagree a little bit. I do believe there are such things as fallen fundamentalists. And that there is evolution is possible there, though I wouldn't jump up and down about the eager expectation that it's going to happen en masse overnight. But I don't think you can sort of falsely jerry-rig the system. I think there are I think the truth wills itself out here. So you can set up certain paradigms where you can't say this and you can't do this. I'm not sure that has all that much integrity for very long. I think eventually, people are going to run as who they are. And you're going to have to be prepared for that. And you're not going to be able to, that if you drive things underground here, I think you're probably going to ask for more trouble than it's worth. You want these things to be open. And particularly, one thing about Islamists is they do tend to be open. I think you want that. You want people. One of the ways you're going to judge this democratically is to see whether, in fact, that is appealing to to the vast majority of Muslims. So let them say what they believe. Don't let them. One thing. You don't want them to practice the Iranian habit of taqiyya. That you don't want to develop. Let them say it straight out and let it rip, because then I think you're going to get a better assessment of whether the people really do believe them. You hope you will start to deprive them of the benefit, which may be large, of the protest vote, where a lot of people could vote for Islamists even though they don't like them, because it is really one of the few means that they think might be a credible protest against the system.
We'll take three final questions. Steve, and then Walid, and then Imam.
Stephen Brook from the Nixon Center. And being at the Nixon Center here, I'd like to just start with a little realism in that we should probably be thinking about broadening our alliances while simultaneously narrowing on our enemies. And Dr. Pipes, I was wondering if you could comment on this specifically. On your idea of Islamists as sort of a block running the span from the radical to the moderate. I mean, we know that Zawahiri has written a book criticizing the Muslim Brotherhood for their participation in the elections. You see the same thing with Zarqawi and his mentor Makdisi. And I was wondering, I mean, should we be trying to use this to further split and refine who our actual problem, immediate number one problem is right now, or is this kind of a fool's errand?
I would characterize these as tactical differences. There's agreement on goals and intense differences over how you achieve those goals, comparable to, say, the kind of divisions in the communist movement, of which there were many and sometimes very vicious. Yes, by all means we should exploit them, but we should do so with the understanding that these are all our enemies, all wish us ill, but taking advantage of the differences between them, for sure.
Well, Walid Malouf with USAID. I think the differences between Reuel and Daniel is, I feel Reuel has more belief in the Middle Eastern people, that they will be able to make the change. While Daniel, you want to still work with maybe elite for this change. I personally like the faster track. And the faster track for two reasons. Number one is I would like you and me to be around when this historical change is taking place. 22 years is so far out, it scared me. And the second reason, I think the belief of the Middle Eastern people, which I do believe in them, like Reuel, is because if you give them the right ambiance, the right atmosphere, I think they will speak up and they will take the right size for themselves. I'll give you an example, for example, Lebanon, in this case. Have you ever imagined a Lebanese prime minister, Sunni Muslim, will ask Syria for diplomatic relations and demarcation of the lines between Lebanon and a Maronite did not ask this in an official capacity. So the belief of the believing in the Lebanese, in the Middle Eastern people, I think, and give them the right ambiance, it will move the democratic process faster. And this is my question to you. Let's take the Iraq example. It's been 2.5 years. And they moved on from, to make my question a little bit short, from A to yesterday when they voted on the Constitution. Don't you think that as the process moves forward and democracy take hold, as painful as it has been for us as Americans, don't you think that this will eliminate little by little terrorism, jihadism, and all those you think are more in charge?
Will successes of democracy in Iraq decrease terrorism? I don't believe that they're necessarily connected. Indeed, there has been, if anything, an increase in terrorism. We, the democratic states of the West, have seen a distinct increase in terrorism, and increasingly as well from domestic populations. So I think that terrorists are not so much protesting the repression in which they live as they are looking at mechanisms they can use to achieve their goals. And if you're an Islamist and you're taking on the U.S. government and its allies, you're clearly not going to start building tanks and ships, even if you had the means to. You have no chance of success with fighter aircraft against the United States, even if you could. You can deploy low-intensity conflict, terrorism, against the United States effectively. So if you're a strategist looking at what works, terror is one of the mechanisms. And whether the state is democratic or not, I think, is quite secondary to that.
Hillel Franken of the Hudson Institute Center on Islam and Democracy. My question really is directed to Reuel. Unfortunately, it's a rather general one. I wish it could be more specific, but my problem is I do not understand as yet what kinds of discriminations or distinctions you would have American policy make in the current circumstances. It seems to me that your argument with or your disagreement with Dan is we have to be practical. The old policy didn't work. I agree with you. It didn't work. Then it led to the kinds of resentments that have given us 9/11. I agree with that also. We have to try something else. That something else has to be democratic. And after that, it seems to me there's nothing more. You say, for example, at the outset that the willingness to accept Islamists, that Islamists will come to the fore in elections, doesn't mean that you embrace them. But I don't see, and that's a plausible position. Some people are trying to articulate that position or propose it, but I don't see how you propose that American policy will make those discriminations. It seems to be just a train that, is on the tracks. We just have to get out of its way and see whether it actually gets to a station or wrecks, including us.
I don't think you want to whet my appetite for policy recommendations. No, I think that's not hard. I mean, let's just take two cases. Let's take Egypt and Azerbaijan. I mean, they're both very interesting cases, somewhat different. Egypt is vastly more important. I think the United States needs to state very clearly that, all right, we're going to have a program to encourage the opening of the system. And we're going to tie that program directly to aid. And we're going to rhetorically increase the pressure on Egypt. And we're going to do what we can to keep it. We want to see elections there, real elections, not fake elections, sooner, not later. We want to accelerate the system. We're going to do the same thing in Azerbaijan. If we find out that Aliyev is going to cheat, which I think he is going to cheat, on the legislative elections, then we're going to call him to account. Actually, I think Dan Fried probably will do that. There are many things the United States could do, but rhetorically, you have to get your house in order, and also just philosophically. I mean, there is a real, as we have it here, there is a real, sincere, honest debate inside the American government, which is going to continue to accelerate, which is, I think, going to be probably the debate, is, all right, how uncomfortable are we with the possibility that Islamic activists, Islamists, fundamentalists, however you're going to call them, could in fact win an election. In the past, I think that has precluded us from thinking about a whole variety of different issues and a whole variety of different approaches towards the Middle East. That debate has to be settled, because that will determine how active we want to be and what things we want to do. Well, no, you settle it always. You settle it by we go back and forth, and may the best man win.
If you had your druthers, what are you?
Oh, I would set up a 3-year process, and if Mubarak hasn't opened up the system in 3 years, I'd cut off every bloody penny. I mean, that's not hard. I mean, I might extend it to 4, but I wouldn't give him that much. I wouldn't give him that much lead time.
The question is how. You pose the question is not how we would get there, but how uncomfortable we will be if we get there, and then how uncomfortable should we be, and how should we respond to it?
What do you mean uncomfortable?
If we get an Islamist government in Egypt.
Well, I think you have to say we could be very uncomfortable. I'd actually argue that is what, if that happens, that's part of the evolutionary process here, and don't go wild about it. That what you want to ensure is that you don't have an Islamist government coming through revolutionary means. That if, in fact, you are, and I have doubts whether, in fact, an Islamist government would come to power in Egypt, but it might. It certainly might. It's more likely to happen, by the way. The longer this process is protracted, the more that you deny it, the more you continue to support the regime, the Mubarak or his successor. I think you make the process and the odds in the end a lot worse. I think you bring in the possibility of an Iranian parallel. You don't want to go that way. We absolutely don't want to go that way. You want to make the system change from the bottom up. You want to have, you ideally, I don't think that's going to happen, but you ideally want to have some colored revolution in the Middle East. Pick your color. Green. That's what you... light green. No, light green. that you want the evolution to occur as softly as you can, but you've got to have some type of evolution. And where I don't really know. I'd have to sit here and talk to Daniel more. Whether Daniel really thinks that evolution is going to happen on a time frame that is going to be, within the next 200 or 300 years. If that's the case, I think it's very bad, because again, I take bin Ladenism very, very seriously. I think it's going to come after us and after us and after us and after us. And I think, though I completely agree with Daniel, is that we also have, I think, a somewhat separate issue in Europe, with the Muslims in Europe who are really going to be the most lethal foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda. But I think the two are connected. But if we don't start the process, if we don't see that evolution in the Middle East, and we don't see it sooner or later, because these things take time, I think we're just asking for enormous, enormous trouble down the road.
To sum up, we agree that change is necessary. We agree that it's not going to be comfortable, to use your term, to have Islamists in power. We disagree over the priority of keeping Islamists out of power, and we most specifically disagree over the timetable. I shudder at the notion of giving Mubarak 3 or 4 years. I'd be more inclined to 20, 25 years, and not so much give it as an ultimatum as make our plans for long-term transformation, during which time the Egyptians learn the processes of democracy. I do not have faith in the people. I just think it's going to take them time. You cannot go out of tyranny into full democracy in a matter of months. And my example A is Iraq. I do not think it can work. You cannot take people who've lived for 30 years and more under Saddam Hussein's brutal regime in his dungeon and suddenly turn them into full-scale Democrats. There are too many arguments to be settled, too many conspiracy theories to be laid to rest, too many extremist impulses for that to take place so quickly. So there are certainly bases for agreement and, of course, some for disagreement. Thank you.
Can I just say real quick, I can't wait for the leaked 25-year policy planning paper from State Department on democratization in the Middle East.
Thank you. Before you do that, thank you to both of you and to the audience. Let me just add a few sort of closing comments. We talked a little bit about Turkey and Azerbaijan, and I want to make 2 points. One, you did mention Ataturkism led to bin Ladenism in the Middle East. But I would argue that maybe the wrong application of that led to it, because I don't think the debate is whether you support the repressive, corrupt seculars versus the Islamists. In Turkey, you did have a democratic process that started even before Ataturk. So Turkey is a unique country, but we can learn certain things from the Turkish experiment. And in terms of Azerbaijan, Jackson Dill has a very good piece today discussing Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Both of them are oil-rich, majority Muslim countries, and soon we'll have elections. And what the U.S. government has done, I think this is the first time, and maybe there's more hope compared to Middle East, because there is not that 40-year of baggage that has been building. But in Azerbaijan and in Kazakhstan, the U.S. policy is to support evolutionary change, but not to wait 20 years, to see very gradual, but at the same time clear progress. And in fact, the U.S. government has, as you said, Dan Fried and others, have tied close U.S. relations with those two very important, as far as Kazakhstan, for example, very significantly oil-rich countries, to how these elections are handled. And again, sitting and discussing this at the Nixon Center from a realist perspective, there's a lot of discussion about that. Should the U.S. tie its relations so closely to what happens on an election day? But the U.S. has done that, and we'll see. I think the big initial test is going to be how we're going to see these policies developing after elections, because I think you're right that what we have seen already in Azerbaijan is that it's not going to be an easy ride. So again, thank you very much for all of you for coming, and I think as any good discussion, I think both of our speakers raised more questions than answered them, so please give them a big applause. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Hey, how are you?
Then I don't disagree with him on it either. I think you're both right. It's just a question.
You have a certain absorbent interest.
No, I think you're looking at a slightly different angle.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. No, I'm going to send an email around to people, and I'm going to say, okay.
I mean, I don't see so much.